Welcome to the fourth in our series of videos going through our Joke API tutorial, which illustrates how our SweetEngine API engine operates. If you remember from our third video that we were constructing URL paths to call APIs with variables that were determined at runtime. And in that video, we showed how to use a value from a table record in our API call. In this video, our fourth video, we'll continue that, constructing the URL paths with a variable determined at runtime, but this time we'll specify a key value runtime parameter. So think of, if we had a coding solution where we could prompt the user for the number of jokes that we wanted to retrieve, how to pass that to the API function so that it will retrieve that number of jokes. Future videos from here will start to see what happens, what we can do with the response of the data that we're getting back from the API call. So let's go to the next slide. And so what are our objectives for our fourth video? Again, we're constructing API variables, essentially the parameters, the URL parameters that we're sending to the API call with values that were provided at runtime. And we talked about the concept of API parameters in our last video. This time we'll be creating the API parameter, a key value API parameter with the UI versus handling it in code. And then we'll also review a little bit more the life cycle of an API message, which we introduced in the last video, but it warrants going over a little more. So if you remember, an API message essentially represents a single API call to whatever API set that we're doing. And in that, we choose an API function and then add API parameters. And remember, everything that we're doing here in our API message lifecycle can be done through code. But at this point in time in our video series, we're seeing how far we can get with just the UI and no coding whatsoever. After we add the parameters, then we can tell the message to build the request, send it to the appropriate endpoint, receive a response, and then the last step is process a response. In our video so far, we have done nothing with processing the responses, but we will in the next couple of videos after this one. So let's go and let's look at our solution so far, which again is all done without any code whatsoever. And so let's take a look. Remember, these are the functions. These last four were essentially the URL parameters that we were sending to the Joke API were static, meaning that they didn't change. So they were very specific calls. But we started constructing this one up here, get 10 jokes, with more dynamic parameters. And so one of the things that we did is we have a URL path in here. Oh, sorry, it was this API call. We have a URL path in here that was essentially variable that we're using our value processing type with the parameter record. Over here, we specified the table number that parameter record would represent, and that this is the field that we wanted to use in this part of the parameter building process. What we've still left static in this one are in the URL parameters, where we're telling it how many jokes do we want to get back. So in this case, we're getting back 10, and that's essentially a static value, meaning every time that we call this API function, it's going to retrieve 10 jokes. So let's see what we can do to make this more dynamic. So just like we did with the table record, we can say, hey, we want our value processing type to determine the value that we're getting by an API parameter, which will essentially be done on a message by message basis. Okay, we'll send an empty value if that's not present, and the static name is kind of important. What does the API? So even though we used an uppercase here for our name, this is essentially our name for the parameter. But when we send it up to the API call, we want it to use this lowercase value. So that's still correct. So we have this ready. Now we need to specify the parameters. So if you remember, what we would do is go back and essentially create a new message. And we have the section for parameters down here. So one of the things that we first need to add is our table record, because remember, we also have the category as a variable. So let's just search for item category. And we want it to get miscellaneous jokes. So we'll choose that record, say OK. So now we have one API parameter that represents the item category table. And we know that our parameter is going to pull a field from within that table, but we essentially have the whole record loaded. So our API variables can now use anything from the item category table that it chooses. So we're going to add another parameter, and we're going to say this one is a key value. And the key value, essentially the key to this is going to be amount, which was the name. Remember, it has an uppercase, the name that we gave it. And the value is going to be 5. So now we've specified our second parameter that is essentially a text value that we have from a key amount equals 5. So let's go through. Let's now take some actions, and we're essentially going to do the manual processing again, which essentially steps through our process. So we'll do send. Okay. And in this case, we did get a response. It says that there were no errors, which is good. And remember that we said amount equals 5. So it's telling us how many jokes it gave us back from that category. And you can see that they're all from the miscellaneous category. Here's the URL that we generated. So essentially this part was variable determined at runtime based on the item category that we put in the parameter. And this amount was essentially our key value 5 here, how it determined it. Let's take a better look at the data. This is kind of prep us for our next video where we're actually going to do something with this. So we can go to related and then see the message buffer, which we actually haven't generated yet. Our status is still in response. So we need to take kind of the next action and say, let's load the response. So essentially the data buffer is one of the steps in our API message lifecycle, where it's going to create this thing called a data buffer that we're eventually going to use in our response processing. So let's go ahead and take a look at our data buffer now. And we can see, here are the 2 headings, but then we essentially have an array of jokes from the miscellaneous category. Here's where another one starts. Here's where another one starts. Here's the 4th one. And then we should have 5 there. and then that's it. So what we've successfully done is be able to provide two parameters based at runtime for this particular API message. One for what category we wanted to retrieve the jokes from, and the second one for the number of jokes that we wanted to get back. So I hope you enjoyed this next segment, this next piece of the puzzle, in making API calls from Business Central using the Suite Engine API engine. And so until next time, where we actually are going to do something with this response that we get back. And thanks for watching.